Hi, my name is Juliet Selgren, and this is my podcast, The Great Antidote. This podcast has been brought to you by the Center for Growth and Opportunity at Utah State University. To learn more, visit www.thecgo.org. Hi, welcome back. Today it is my great honor to talk to Jonathan Rauch, a fellow at Brookings Institution. He is a contributing editor of the National Journal and The Atlantic, and he's also the author of many books, including his free speech classic, Kindly Inquisitors, The New Attacks on Free Thought. The book was published 27 years ago, but it is possibly more relevant today than when it was published. Greg Lukianoff of FIRE, who I interviewed recently, says that this book is one of the best modern defenses of free speech we have today, and another one of my previous guests, George Will, called it, quote, slender and sharp as a stiletto, unquote. If you need any two people to recommend you a book, they are those people. Today, I want to continue a conversation on free speech that I started on this podcast with David French of The Dispatch and Lukianoff. We are going to be talking about whether free speech is under unprecedented attack, and if it is, what drives this suppression of speech, and what cancel culture is. We're going to talk about that too. And I hope he'll give us tips on how to best deal with censors and cancelers. So, welcome.
Nice to be here.
First, I want to ask you, what is the most important thing that people my age or in my generation should know that we don't?
I don't know about the most important thing, but an important thing is that free speech is the only safe space for minorities. Something I say a lot because although it used to be something that minority rights activists, people like, Martin Luther King and even Frederick Douglass knew and said often, John Lewis, the late John Lewis, civil rights hero, used to say that without free speech, civil rights movement would have been a bird without wings. But these days, a lot of people your generation think that free speech harms minorities because it allows people to say oppressive things and say hurtful things. And that's just wrong. I've been a gay rights activist for most of my adult life. And without free speech, we would be just nowhere right now.
That's a great response to this question. So let's dive right in. I've heard you say the following about it, that, quote, the idea that wrong-headed, dangerous, heretical, and blasphemous ideas should be not allowed but protected is a little nutty, end quote. But you add, quote, the single most successful social principle ever invented, end quote. Can you tell us what you mean by that?
I noticed, Juliet, in your intro, you asked the question, is free speech under unprecedented attack? And I remember hearing that and thinking, no, actually, it's under very precedented attack. The idea here is it's a very new idea. It really only goes back in the form we know it to the mid-17th century John Locke, or a little bit before him. And this is the idea you just mentioned, which is that if someone says something that's, really stupid, wrong-headed, potentially destructive, heretical, seditious, that should not only be allowed, it should actually be protected. Well, no one, until those people came along, ever ran a society that way. They would have thought that was just crazy. It's the most counterintuitive idea of all time. On the other hand, it also turns out to be the most successful social idea of all time, bar none. We owe science, technology, the extraordinary outburst of human learning and technology and freedom to this idea. It's been spectacularly successful. So it's kind of strange. The most successful social idea ever is also the most counterintuitive. And that just means there's just always, constantly, forever, there are going to be attacks on it from all kinds of quarters. And people like you and me, and then your children and your grandchildren will just need to get up every morning of every day for the rest of their lives forever and defend this crazy idea from scratch. And we just need to be cheerful about that because we're doing actually an amazing job of winning with that principle.
It seems like we're not winning a lot of the time, though. I don't know. It seems like it's always I mean, it's always an uphill battle. It's kind of like Sisyphus and the myth of Sisyphus. It's like we're always fighting this uphill battle. We're always trying to roll the rock back up to the top. And I guess you're right. We do have to be cheery about that.
Yep, that's our job. Just keep that rock rolling. But it's not the same rock. And that's important to understand. What we're seeing today, stuff like cancel culture, what's going on in campuses, but also something that worries me even more, which we might or might not have time to talk about, that's disinformation and propaganda. Um, these are different things from what we saw in the past. I remind people that in my grandfather's generation, the greatest English language novel of the 20th century, Ulysses, was banned by the United States government, and it was burned on the docks when Random House imported a bunch of them. I mean, think about that. Nothing like that today. Or think about in the 1950s, the first openly gay magazine that was not pornographic, just a regular magazine. It was called One, O-N-E. It was 1953. It was banned by the US government, by the Postal Service. And in those days, if you couldn't put something in the mail, there was absolutely no way to distribute it. Well, that's unthinkable today. What happened to civil rights movement people? John Lewis was arrested for carrying signs saying one man, one vote. I mean, he was arrested for that. So actually, I think in many ways, the enemies of free speech today are a lot less powerful than when they had the mighty engines of the state behind them. So I would take these problems instead of those problems if that's the only choice I have. But I'd also recognize the problems are going to keep moving around. So we'll have to be as ingenious as the other side. And as I say, let's be cheerful about that. It's a great calling. It's a great cause.
I mean, when thinking about the progress we've made in respect to that, it does put it really into perspective, and people saying things on Instagram don't seem as much a threat as those who threaten civil rights. When you said disinformation and propaganda, what did you mean? I was kind of thinking of social media when you said that people say things all the time, and I'm like, I'm pretty sure that's not true. But I don't know, what did you mean by that?
So this will come back when we talk about canceling. This is relevant. So let's make a distinction right here between two things. One is criticism and one is propaganda. Criticism, as we're going to define it for this phone call, is the attempt to it's expressing an argument or an opinion with the goal of influencing public opinion through rational persuasion. That's when I use arguments and evidence to try to persuade you of something. That's how we get knowledge, the so-called marketplace of ideas. Propaganda and disinformation take the form of criticism because they're people with words making a point, but they have a very different goal. Their goal is to organize or manipulate the social environment or the media environment with the goal or predictable effect of deplatforming someone, isolating them, intimidating them for political reasons. What they're doing is information warfare. It's not aimed at criticism, at advancing knowledge. It's aimed at political advantage. Well, one way of doing that, as we'll discuss, is canceling. But it turns out there's another way of doing it. It's not brand new by any means. It's been done now for almost a century. And that's where you flood the zone with bad information. You take advantage of people's various forms of psychic need to pollute the information environment so people no longer can tell what's true and what's false. And then they throw up their hands, they become cynical, they become disbelieving. They say, I don't believe anyone. And that in turn opens the door to demagogues, populist tyrants, people like Donald Trump, who is waging an information warfare campaign against the United States, something that no previous president or administration has done. So that's not a new thing, but you are correct that it's been turbocharged by social media. Disinformation was once very expensive to do. If you were the Soviet government, you had to forge a bunch of documents and then you had to plant them in the media. You had to find media that would pick up the story. All of this was very expensive and time consuming, and it very often didn't work. Well, now all you have to do is just start experimenting on social media. You get a bunch of people in a building in St. Petersburg, and they just start dropping stuff on Facebook and Twitter, and they use algorithms to see what sticks, and then it multiplies. And next thing you know, it's all over the internet. And so disinformation has become orders of magnitude easier to do. It's polluting the information environment. It's making it harder for people to know what's true and what's false. It creates cynicism and confusion. And that's the goal, cynicism and confusion.
That doesn't sound...
Sorry about the long answer, by the way. I hope, cut me off if I'm rattling on too much.
No, it's great. I love it. It's very direct information. It's not disinformation. It's informing of disinformation. So we'll get to cancel culture in a minute, but I kind of want to build up to it. So you recently signed, along with many other writers on the right and the left of the political spectrum, the Harper's letter called A Letter on Justice and Open Debate. This letter warns that, quote, the free exchange of information and ideas, the lifeblood of a liberal society, is daily becoming more constricted, end quote. And it adds, quote, the restriction of debate, whether by a repressive government or an intolerant society, invariably hurts those who lack power and makes everyone less capable of democratic participation, end quote. And you mentioned this before in your response to my first question. So can you tell us how this letter came about and why you signed it?
It came about because Thomas Chatterton, Williams, and George Packer, I think, were two writers who saw a need for it and I think drafted it. I wasn't one of the drafters, so I can't give you the behind the scenes view. I can only tell you that when George came to me and said, do you want to sign this? I said, of course, I'd be honored to sign it. I think that the problem they're identifying is very real, and it's been called cancel culture. Before the word cancel culture came along, I called it socially enforced conformity. It's a form of social coercion. It's also a form of information warfare, but instead of operating by causing chaos and confusion like disinformation, it tries to organize and manipulate the social environment to use coercive social mechanisms to intimidate, deplatform, or isolate its targets. And it discovered the kind of soft underbelly of free speech culture, which is it's very hard now to use the government directly to censor or silence someone, but you can go after someone's employer. Or, maybe if it's Juliet Selgren, go after their school, right? This is a student who said some terrible things on Twitter. She needs to be disciplined, kicked out of school. But they go after your school, your professional associations, or especially your employer with the goal of getting you punished. And if they can do this to a few people, they intimidate all the other people who are onlookers and say, well, gee, I really don't want that to happen to me, so I'm going to be quiet. I'm going to self-censor. So actually, it doesn't take very many of these incidents to get a lot of self-censorship going on. And that is a different way of manipulating the social and media environment. So this also is a form of information warfare. People get confused about it because it takes the form of free speech. They'll say, well, look, it's just, people who are traditionally oppressed, marginalized groups are criticizing powerful people. Powerful people don't like that, so they write the Harper's letter. Well, actually, that's not what it is at all. This is very different from criticism, because criticism is about rational persuasion. It's not about punishing people, isolating them, shutting them down. Totally different goal here. So it is important to distinguish these things in principle, even though in practice it can be hard to tell apart in particular cases.
And the letter itself caused a stir, right? I mean, I remember reading people who were attacking Matt Iglesias at Vox for signing it. One Vox staffer was so vocal about it. And even though she insisted that she wasn't trying to get him fired, that she felt very threatened by him signing just because of the other people who signed. That seems kind of ironic. That's cancel culture, right?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's still canceling if you say this person makes me unsafe at work. By the way, don't fire this person. The problem is if you do that inside your office, if you go to the to your boss and you say, we have a problem here, let's deal with it, then your boss can deal with it. But when you're doing this on social media, when you go public with this, what this person at Vox is doing is recruiting the entire internet to come flaming down on the person who signed the Harper's letter, Matt Iglesias. And they know they're recruiting the entire internet. And that's one of the hallmarks of cancel culture. You start these public shaming campaigns. The problem with these campaigns is that once they start, there's no telling where they will end. They're completely out of the control of the person who started them or anyone else. Little known fact, you probably know that in America in colonial times, one form of punishment was called the stocks. People were shamed by their community by being locked in the public square so their hands were immobilized and their head was exposed. And then other people would come by and taunt them, for example, or throw things at them. Well, this was banned. And one reason it was banned is that the courts realized once you put someone in the stocks, there was no way to tell what the punishment would be. People could get killed. It was up to bystanders to figure it out. Well, canceling is like that. Once this stuff hits the social media, there's no telling where it'll end. Who will get fired? How many people will get fired? How much damage will be done? There's no controlling it. And that's one of the reasons it's so unfair.
That's an interesting comparison. I mean, I haven't spent much time trying to think of comparisons for it, but I think that one really fits. And I don't know, that is just an insane thing to think about, that it is up to the public. It's not in your hands. It's not in your boss's hands. No one can fix it. You can't do damage control after it's done. It's not your choice. If you get fired, it's because of the internet. It's because of everyone else.
Yeah, and not just fired, by the way. People's entire lives have been ruined by this, because once you have a reputation as having been a racist, or once you're made radioactive, which is the real point of this campaign, it makes someone so controversial, no one wants to hire them. If they're a professor, they'll get denounced by 300 other professors, and then they won't be able to get jobs, and they won't get on committees, and their friends will turn their back on them. So there's all kinds of ways in which this can be just devastating for people when it happens. Not just jobs, though jobs are a big part of it. Something else I'll mention here goes back to the very first comment I made about minorities. Mm-hmm. If you wonder if this is new, the answer is no. And one way you can know that is to ask an American homosexual. In other words, me. So you're fortunately a bit too young to have lived through this period. But in the 50s and on into the 60s and 70s, when the repression of homosexuals in America was at its worst, the main way that this was done was by canceling. We didn't have the word for it at the time. But what would happen is that, for example, if you were booked on a sex misdemeanor because some undercover cop nailed you in a bathroom, then you would have a misdemeanor charge on your record, and it would usually be dismissed the next day with a fine, except then your employer would be told about it. Well, now you have a misdemeanor charge, you're immediately fired from your job, and then you can't get another job. If it's a government job, you're blacklisted for life, and you lose your security clearance if you have one. You're rejected by polite society. You're now what's called a known homosexual, a pariah. So this was the main way that anti-gay repression was enforced for decades in the United States. We know all about that, homosexuals. We were the consistent victims of it. Canceling was perfected. It was weaponized and refined and perfected against us. So it especially breaks my heart that a lot, not all, but a lot of LGBT activists are now using against other people the exact same mechanism that was deployed so devastatingly against us. It's a terrible irony, and it's very sad and very misguided, and it just breaks my heart.
It's awful. I did not know that being gay was illegal in the US at a time until literally, I think, 2 weeks ago, which is insane. And if I don't know it, and I feel like I try to inform myself and I try to look and read stuff about the past and all of that, but I'm just thinking, if I didn't know that, who else doesn't know that? Who else?
That's interesting.
Was not aware?
What year were you born?
2003.
What year and what month?
March.
What month? March of 2003. So in your lifetime, it was illegal to have gay sex, to be intimate with your own partner, even in your own house. It was illegal during your lifetime. That law was not struck down until June or July of 2003.
That
And yeah, it's nuts, right? And people say, well, the law wasn't necessarily enforced. Well, first of all, it was enforced, and one of the way it was enforced was canceling.
that's so I don't even have a word. It's frustrating, but more than it's like infuriating. But ooh, what do you
Yeah, how did
think?
you find out that sodomy was illegal in 2000 till 2003?
I was doing an interview with David Bose and it came up. I don't remember what content. I think we were talking about something about freedom and then that came up. And I was so shocked. I was so surprised. I had no idea. And that is just the media and everyone has like a 2-second memory. It's like the second it happens, it's gone. You don't remember it anymore. I don't know. Uh,
Yeah, the gay civil rights movement is not taught in schools. Someday it will be. But you've never heard of Frank Kameny, the greatest gay civil rights leader, who was the hero in this campaign against canceling because he was the guy in 1958. He was fired from his government job. And instead of crawling under a rock the way he was supposed to, he fought at every level. He wrote letters to Congress. He filed a Supreme Court brief. Um, and then he started representing other gay people who were being fired and canceled. And he encouraged them to come forward and protest the injustice of this. And it took a long time. It was not easy, don't get me wrong. It took a lot of bravery from a lot of people. But it was pushing back and saying this is intolerable that eventually turned the tide. And that's kind of what we're trying to do with the Harper's letter, saying, this should not stand. And a lot of people who signed that letter were left of center. And that's important. They're saying these activists, many of them left leaning, who claim to represent us, they are not speaking in the interests of minorities.
that is so inspiring. What do you think is different about today's battle against free expression and cancel culture compared to other periods like then, or even like the civil rights movement in like the 1960s?
So it's much more about culture now and much less about law in the United States. And as I said earlier, that's a trade I'm actually pretty happy to make. I would really rather not have the mighty engines of government oppressing me, throwing me in jail, threatening me with large fines, and so forth. Still, if you don't have a culture that's friendly to freedom of speech, freedom of expression, and inquiry, then the law doesn't help you as much as it should. John Stuart Mill famously made this point in On Liberty. Basically, he said, if you don't have a culture of free speech, then no amount of laws will protect you. So that's important to realize. And that's why I think the focus is shift increasingly away from government censorship and towards social coercion. And by the way, a lot of libertarians are uncomfortable with that because they're really only worried about government activity. And they'll say, well, if it's not the government that's oppressing you, it's just private individuals making personal choices. So among libertarians, there's a healthy debate about this. And I side with the group that says, no, free speech is a value. It's not just a law. And you need people to maintain their value in their beliefs and in their personal life and in the way they treat other people, not just strictly in following the law.
I do believe that this is a big problem and that people standing by their values is what is important in this time, even if there isn't really a legal aspect to it anymore. I don't know, I see it every day. I see it like every second of every day. And I don't know if people older than me see it as much as I do. I mean, they probably do. People are getting fired. I don't have a job, but I see it on social media. And these are the younger generations are the ones who are pressing everyone, no matter the age. It's such a big problem. I don't know.
Do you find the culture among people your age in your world is hostile to true diversity of opinion, free speech?
In my inner circle, not as much, but around me, it definitely is. And even if you're just a mutual acquaintance with someone, you have to be careful about what you say because otherwise they will turn the masses against you, which is awful. I don't know why it's like it's just should not be like that. Even my teachers are like that. It's kind of you can see that they kind of press that on the students, but they also have an air of caution as though they don't want to be caught saying something that is taken the wrong way or anything like that because it will be turned against them.
How much do you worry about that personally in your own life? Do you self-censor much?
I try not to because the people who know me, and that's all that really matters. And who else is going to bring some originality to the debates we have at school, to the discussions we have, if there's not someone who has an opposing viewpoint? But I try to be mindful of my word choice just because I don't want my words to be what is focused on instead of whatever else I'm trying to say. Like if I'm using an example, I try to kind of move past it as quickly as possible so that I can't accidentally get caught in something that was not intended. So I guess yeah, a bit.
So you're not so much censoring yourself, but you are inflecting in ways that you'll try to deflect arguments, misunderstandings, which of course in polite society is not all bad. You want people to be sensitive to each other. You want them to find ways to express their views that are constructive and not abusive. I'm all for that. I'm not someone who wants anyone to be obnoxious for the sake of it. One of the great things about culture, what I call liberal science, which is the culture of free inquiry that we have, is all the ways it finds to encourage people to express themselves in civil and polite ways. Like if you think about science, for example, um, no scientific article that you can think of begins with the words "you ignorant bitch." For example, it would not only be out of place, it would be completely repellent. Instead, you find arguments and evidence if you want to get ahead. And so society, people forget this. Society has lots of ways of regulating the truly obnoxious, the most important of which is just ignoring them. If some of these provocateurs who go around on campuses getting protested were instead greeted by critics, their speaking fees would go way down and no one would buy their books and they would disappear from the pages of history. It is counterproductive and strategically kind of dumb to decide to rise to the bait every time some moron says something that seems obnoxious. And so, when we also have the power to reframe and reinterpret the things people say to us, people say words hurt. Well, of course, words can hurt, but we do have agency over how we interpret and respond to words in ways that we don't when someone hits me over the head with a club. So, when someone calls me a fucking faggot, which has happened, I could interpret that as meaning that I'm a fucking faggot, or I could interpret that as meaning that the person who said it is a moron. And I choose the latter interpretation. So I just walk away from it. I'm not interested in it. So marginalizing, ignoring, walking away, dialing down, instead of reacting to everything as though it's traumatizing, try reacting as if it's annoying. Dial it down to annoying instead of up to outrage. We have a lot more control in these situations than we give ourselves credit for. And using that is just a much better way of dealing with it than always hitting the wall.
It Whenever I think about people that do this, it makes me think that they're trying to baby themselves. And I just don't understand why. If you are an adult, you are an adult. You are not a baby. You do not need to be protected from words. Sticks and stones can break my bones, but words can never hurt me. Is that not something that people can protect themselves? And if like sure something is mean, but if you are an adult, and if you can understand that it's not you, it's them, then I just, you know? I kind of
Well, there's an ideology behind this. It's been called emotional safetyism, and it's actually fairly new. It's not something that we saw a lot of in the past, but the notion here is that words can be just as damaging emotionally as physical acts can be physically or emotionally, and therefore we have a right, a positive human right to be safe from hurtful words. Well, the problem with that is first, the criticism is hurtful often by definition, even when it's framed very politely in science. If I write an article saying that the work you spent the last 5 years on is a pile of steaming rubbish, that's potentially devastating to you. So once you make criticism a human rights violation, you're basically saying science, inquiry, free speech is a human rights violation, which means then you're going to have someone who regulates it. And that's going to be someone who comes along saying, nope, that's not safe. That's not safe. That's not safe. Well, back to my experience as a homosexual American, if we'd had laws against unsafe words back in the day, you know who those laws would have been used against, right? Me. Because we were expressing the outrageous proposition that there's nothing wrong with homosexuality. We said gay young people should be allowed to express themselves as who they are. Well, the rest of the world thought that meant we were trying to subvert and pervert and recruit children. What could be more dangerous than that? They thought we were trying to bring God's wrath down on America if they were religious. What could be more dangerous than that? So the unsafe words doctrine, I believe, is fundamentally inimical to free speech and the advancement of knowledge. But it's an ideology, and it does, I think, lie behind the phenomenon you're meeting, which is people dialing up to making a maximal claim about the unsafety that they're experienced when they're exposed to viewpoints they don't like.
This is kind of a radical example of cancel culture. I don't even know if you could call it canceling. Well, it's the most final form of canceling, but that's a kind of light take on something pretty serious. Is when in 2015, a satirical newspaper in France called Charlie Hebdo, which where 12 journalists and staff members were killed by two gunmen because they ran some drawings of the Prophet Muhammad in their paper. And then you talk about it in, like, you're writing often about how the Ayatollah Khomeini put a bounty on the author Salman Rushdie's head for his book, The Satanic Verses. I mean, death or someone ordering billions of Muslims to kill you or putting a bounty on your head, that's the ultimate form of deplatforming and canceling. It's final, as I said before, which is probably not the best way to talk about something so serious. But it seems in a sense that it's much worse than losing one's job, yet I've heard you make the case that it shares some common elements.
Yeah, the punishment is different, which is Rushdie was sentenced to death by Ayatollah Khomeini, whereas I can't remember his full name, but the guy who just tweeted out an accurate summary of a reputable academic study, who was then ganged up on Twitter and lost his job the next day. So he lost his livelihood. And that's not as bad as losing your life. It's still really bad though, right? Especially if your friends won't talk to you. For my book, I've been interviewing targets of canceling. And these are people who wake up one morning after having a normal life and discovering they're pariahs. Their friends are turning against them and signing petitions saying that they're racist or sexist or transphobic or whatever. So it's still pretty awful. But if you set aside the punishment, the crime is basically the same, which is airing opinions which are unsafe, which are offensive, which are heretical, all of which Rushdie did. And many of the methods are the same. One of the common threads, just to name one of any number of examples. In cancel culture, a frequent pattern is that if I denounce an article say that Juliet Selgren has written, it's very common that the activists will not actually have read the article. And in many cases, they'll actually boast about not having read the article. And that was very true in the Rushdie campaign, where Ayatollah Khamenei and lots of people who condemned him to death said, and of course, we haven't read the novel. We don't need to read the novel to know that it's offensive. And we don't want to pollute ourselves to read the novel. One said, you don't have to walk through a sewer to know what filth is, which tells you what's going on in these cases. It's more about a ritual of purification. This is not an engagement with an idea to say why it's wrong. It's about banishing the person who has the idea, whether by killing them or by driving them out of society. It's purification. So that's one of a lot of things that this had in common with Rushdie. And by the way, with what was done to gay people, where there was no real problem of our causing, the undermining of the United States or recruiting children or bringing God's wrath down on America. This was an attempt to purify the country of what was seen to be a form of evil, which is really what's going on here.
And what you said is true. I have seen often more and more that people attack things, but they won't have read the article. They say, "Oh, the fact that the New York Times published this thing by Senator Cotton, that is hurtful." They don't even know what they don't even know what he said. They don't know if they agree or disagree. It's just he wrote it.
Yeah,
That
yeah.
hurts.
The idea won't be encountered. It's more of a question: is this a person, a good person, or a bad person? Which is a very different argument. The greatest innovation of liberal science, as I call it, that's our regime for free speech and using free speech to make knowledge um, by pitting biases against each other and pitting ideas in contention. The greatest innovation of that makes it all possible is that we kill our hypotheses instead of each other. Because for most of human history, when people had important differences of opinion, the way they dealt with that is that one side basically wiped out the other. And if the idea was if you kill the person, then you can kill the idea. And great innovation of science has said, no, you can't do that. You can kill a hypothesis, but you can't touch the person. You don't punish people, you punish wrong ideas. And that turns out to be an absolutely huge innovation in human affairs because that allows you to make mistakes without fear of losing your life or your livelihood. And the genius of science, the reason we're about to have a COVID vaccine in absolutely stunning record time, used to take decades to get vaccines and then years, and it looks like we might get this one in months. The reason is that science makes mistakes incredibly quickly. It just churns through millions and millions of wrong hypotheses every day in order to find the few that are right. And in order to do that, you have to be able to let people make mistakes and catch each other's mistakes without risking their whole life or livelihood in the process. One of the dangers of canceling, I try to emphasize this, is it's not just that it's a danger to free speech, to what we can say. It's a danger to knowledge, to what we can know, because you cannot make knowledge in an environment where people are afraid to challenge conventional wisdom and introduce new ideas. All they'll be doing is rehashing stale dogmas.
I like comparing it to science. I like drawing the comparison, or I guess the opposite comparison. I guess contrasting it with science, because in science they try and try again. You fail, you try again. But everywhere else, if you fail or if you even slightly say something wrong, you are out. You're done. Your life over. And you've mentioned earlier, and we kind of talked about how the movement cancel culture, it's moral. It's not legal because it's hard to suppress free speech legally anymore. And out of concern for kids my age who are about to go to college is the fact that colleges and universities have taken the lead in attempting to suppress this free speech and that students embrace that idea also. How did we get here? I mean, I know that Greg Lukianoff and Jonathan Haidt have argued that this emotional injury that is a rights violation comes from the way that children are raised nowadays. What do you think?
I think that's an aspect, and Haidt and Lukyanov have written the best book and done the best work on this. So I'd send people to them for that. I'd also point out some other things that happened. For example, the invention of the hostile environment doctrine, which happened in 1989. It actually came out of employment law in the first President Bush's administration. And that's the idea that if people face a hostile environment at work, then they can't work, and that's a rights violation, which is not a bad idea, but quickly spun out of the workplace and into places it didn't belong, like everyday life and like college campuses, where it mutated into, well, if someone encounters a hostile idea, especially if they're a minority at a university, then their rights have been violated. Well, that doctrine does not belong in a university, where the whole point is to generate and counter all kinds of diverse ideas, including some that will offend some people. To me, an even more interesting question is what can be done about this, and specifically, what can Juliet Selgren do about this? Because Juliet Selgren presumably is going to go to college soon, and she may go to a college where she encounters a variety of formal but mostly informal constraints on what she can say. The latest surveys show that 2/3 of college students feel that they are not at liberty to express their opinions, even in class, for fear of offending someone. So what do you do if you find yourself in that environment? I've spent a lot of time on campuses trying to answer that question when students ask it. And I think the best and simplest answer, there's a lot I could say, but the best and simplest answer is that Juliet Selgren should not shut up. A lot of what's going on with cancel culture and coercive environments at universities is an attempt by a minority of students to manipulate the social environment. Again, this is information warfare is what they're doing, manipulating the social environment so it seems that there are a lot more of them than there really are, and that you're an isolated outsider, that resistance is futile, that anything you say will make no difference except to get you in trouble, so you should just be silent and slink off until you graduate 4 years later. That's what they want you to think. And they're using intimidation, coercion to create that environment. But they are the minority, in fact. And the key thing is for students like you to be outspoken when you're disqualified, when someone says, check your privilege, or you're white, so you can't say that, or whatever, call you whatever they're going to call you. You stay calm, you answer back, but you don't shut up, because what they're trying to do is silence you, and they cannot silence you unless you allow yourself to be silenced. And then the second thing you can do, which is just as important, is counter-organize, counter-mobilize. That's starting to happen on university campuses. It is a truism in public policy that an organized minority beats a disorganized majority every time. And the students who are most active about trying to coerce and repress opinions that they don't like are a minority, but they're very well organized. They're very good at coming after people, professors, students who violate their dogmas. Well, you can counter-organize. You can get other students who say, we're not having it. This happened at Reed College, for example, quite effectively. And once you have some friends, once you have some allies, other students, faculty, and the administration, once you counter-organize, then it's group against group. And then the odds are a lot more even.
I was actually about to ask you what your advice would be to me and what I should do going into college and what people my age should do going into college, because it's kind of a fear of mine. I mean, I experience stuff like that now, but looking at college campuses from the outside and seeing all of that is horrifying. And to think that I'm about to go into the midst of that, I think keeping in mind the organized majority and not shutting up, I think that's a perfect way to do that. And I think, honestly, if I ever need strength, I will just re-listen to this episode.
Just call me up.
Yeah, I'll be like,
Just
hey,
call me up. Gay people
I
would be nowhere if we were the wilting flowers that some people make us out to be, that we melt if we encounter hostility and homophobia. Oh, please protect us. We don't want to be protected. We got where we got to by pushing back, by being outspoken, We're here, we're queer, get used to it. Frank Kameny never shrank from an argument. He never tried to silence anyone either, because he understood that every time some ignoramus says something bigoted and stupid about homosexuals, that is an opportunity for him, for our side, to make the better argument, to make our case, to look good by comparison. The haters and the ignoramuses, they were actually, in many ways, our friends. They inadvertently helped us. So I don't know. My message to you at bottom is you have more power than you think, a lot more power than you think. It's like the Wizard of Oz. It's there all along. You just need to use it.
That is a wonderful way to put it. That just makes me laugh. I think I don't think I could forget that. I don't think I want to forget that. That is going to be what I fall back on when I need it. So, I have one last question for you, and that is, what is one thing you believed at one time in your life that you later changed your opinion on, and why?
Well, it doesn't relate to the topic of this podcast.
That's fine.
And there are a lot of things. I take pride in changing my mind about things. As John Maynard Keynes supposedly said, when the facts change, I change my mind. What do you do, sir? This was someone who accused him of flip-flopping. I'm for flip-flopping. But one thing that I changed my mind on that's been quite depressing is that I used to be a real believer in the wisdom of the American electorate to make good choices. And I came to understand in the Trump era that actually the American electorate makes good choices when they have good choices to make. But the guardrails are much, much thinner than I ever thought. And when presented with bad choices, someone like Donald Trump, who was not allowed to get a major party's presidential nomination until 2016, when people like that get on the ballot, the electorate is capable of making terrible choices. And that means that our system, our constitution, our democracy are all much more fragile than I thought before.
That is a very good response. And yes, my listeners, flip-flopping is good. Very good. Changing your mind is a good thing. Learning is a good thing. Thank you so much for talking to me today, and thank you for just defending everything and for spreading the word about defending free speech and promoting equality. Thank you so much for being here today.
I'm very happy to be here. And the reason I'm here, Juliet, is that I'll be out of this fight in 10, 15, 20 years, but you're just starting. You're the next generation to roll that rock back up the hill. And I know you'll do it. I know you'll be up to that job.
Thank you. That made my day.